Well, welcome everyone. We're going to get started in about 30 seconds here. Okay. So welcome everyone to the February Canadian Primary Care Research Network learning session. And I want to acknowledge that we are on the lands of multiple Indigenous people. And today I am in the Mi'kmaq territory, which is on the eastern side of Canada today. So today we're going to talk about clinical trials and enhancing practice-based research and learning networks in doing pragmatic clinical trials. And so clinical trials are seen as an essential part of the healthcare sector and a crucial component of research and innovation. However, most clinical trials do not take place in primary care. And today's session explores shared solutions about the nuts and bolts of what is needed for primary care practice to be involved in pragmatic clinical trials. Today, the presenters will provide examples of how practices and practice-based research and learning networks work together to develop knowledge for primary care. They are going to explain to us burden to clinicians and practices and how this could be minimized while being involved in research and learning. And so today we want to identify what is infrastructure needed for a primary care trial focused on pragmatic clinical trials. Secondly, we want to identify core components needed for practices to participate in pragmatic clinical trials. And thirdly, we want to learn about the role of the Canadian Primary Care Clinical Trial Network. So I want to welcome today two of my colleagues, and I'm so happy that they decided to say yes to this learning session and be part of it. So I'm so very, very grateful to you both. So first, we're going to hear from Dr. Dan Merenstein, and he is a professor and director of research programs of family medicine at Georgetown University Medical Center, and he's in the Department of Human Science and the School of Health. And the second presenter today is Dr. Andrew Pinto, and he is the director of the Upstream Lab. He's a CIHR Applied Public Health Chair and director of UpLearn, and he is an associate professor at the University of Toronto. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dan.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. I'm excited to be here. I think this will be a fun opportunity. I just have a few slides. I think Andrew has a few, and I think we're going to have a lot of time for Q&A, which is really, I think, the goal of this. See my slides there, Sabrina? All right. So I'm going to use as an example the trial that Sabrina's helping us with. She's been a big help in one of our committees. I'll show you the different committee structures. But I'm really just using it as an example. I think it's not really that important on our specific trial. So the goal, what I was told to do, is answer some of the questions that Dr. Wong gave me, and I'm going to do that as I go through the slides and use our current study as an example. And then, as I said, really just answer questions. I think that will be the most helpful part of today's discussion. So to get a scope of what we're doing, we have a large study. It'll be, if we go to the full study, over 3,000 patients for a definitive answer, hopefully, for acute sinusitis, one of the more perplexing problems and more understudied problems in primary care. So we have 6 sites, and the reason I show these is just, you need to really think about your sites to get a large range of diversity and sites and expertise. So we have 6 sites throughout the U.S. We have a separate data coordinating center. When you have such a large study, it's hard to do all the data yourself, and it really helps to have a data coordinating center. The study I'm going to show you, we have an 18-month feasibility phase. I've never done a feasibility phase before. It's been a blessing, and I don't think I would have succeeded without that. But it is hard to get those funded. So you need to think about that when you're applying. But if you can get a funded, sort of a feasibility or / pilot, whatever you want to call it, it is unbelievable help. And then we have a contract, not a grant, and from PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And the reason that's important is grants are much less hands-on with the funder, and our contract is you really work with the funder much closer, and that's something to take into account when you're thinking about how you're going to conduct a trial. You do need a funder who understands these. These are different, and as Sabrina already talked about them, primary care is not really set up to do clinical trials. And unfortunately, if you look at the literature, most of the things we do in primary care are based on subspecialty settings, which is really a shame. I think that we can all agree that the sinusitis seen in ENT office, the acne seen in dermatology office, I could go on and on, is different than the one seen in primary care. But we did a study where we looked at FDA-approved drugs, and almost none of them are from primary care settings. For FDA-approved primary care drugs, almost none of them are in primary care settings. But PCORI really understands pragmatic trials and understands the time it takes. So that they've been great to work with. But you need to think about that when you're applying. If you work with NIH or you work with pharma, do they really understand what they're getting into and how can they do it? These are time and money intensive. All clinical trials are. I would argue primary care ones are even more. And again, because when I talk about, they're just not set up to do that. It's just not the environment in a primary care setting. You need to think about your IRB. That's your ethics board. I'm not sure if you call it the same thing in Canada. I apologize. But it's different. So we, by law, have to have a single IRB if we're going to do a large clinical trial, NIH law. I don't know if that's the same rule in Canada, but it's a big help to have 6 different, or we'd have to have 7 different IRBs. That would be much, much more difficult. So a single IRB has been a big help. And then, like I said, a different data center. You need to think about your team and everything about the team. Who's going to be author? Who's going to have different roles? What have they done before? What do they bring to the table? And you need to do that pretty much all a priori before you even submit a grant, I think. There's so much that goes into this, and I think people really don't understand how much goes into a clinical trial. They think they've done other studies, they've done cohort studies, they've done bench research. I can just do a clinical trial, but there's an expertise and a science to it. Recruitment, if I talk about nothing else, it just be this. Recruitment is the number one issue. It is always the number one issue in primary care and non-primary care settings. Recruitment is the number one issue. There's always a joke among clinical trialists, the best way to treat a disease is to study it. It goes away when you start to study it. Everyone says we have tons of sinusitis come to our office, and then you go to their office, there's no sinusitis. So it is the number one thing, and you need to think about it. You really need to think about it. You need to prepare, and you need to really, really underestimate what you're going to get. If you think you can recruit 5 a week, you might really get 2 a week. You need to really, really think about the numbers. And then things happen. Things like COVID happen, snowstorms happen, et cetera, et cetera. Things happen, and it always affects recruitment. And like I've already talked about, primary care is not set up. So oncology is set up with long visits. It's part of the milieu of oncology that people are going to do clinical trials. And even other subspecialties like rheumatology, et cetera, where the visits are longer. And there's ample time to talk to people about clinical trials and to get them. And it's more even the expectation. If you're going to come see at a tertiary care center a subspecialist, that it's sort of the environment that they're going to talk to you about clinical trials and about experimental things. It's not that in the primary care setting in the suburbs and in your other primary care settings. You really need to think this through. I really like this figure. It was done in 1960. It was repeated in 2000 by some people at the Robert Graham Center in DC. If you have 1,000 people a month, about 800 are going to have a clinical symptom. 327 are going to seek medical care. 217 are going to go to a doc, about half to a primary care doc. 65 are going to go to a complementary alternative medicine provider. 21 to an outpatient clinic. 14 home health. 13 to an ED. 8 are in the hospital. Less than 1's in academic health center. I think you can see my mouse here. I think about this whenever I talk to anyone about a trial, whenever I review a trial, when I talk to my students about a trial. Where was the study conducted? So if you're studying acute sinusitis down here, well, that's not that helpful because acute sinusitis is taken care of out here. Most people don't even come to the clinic, and the ones that come to clinic come to primary care clinic. You need to think about your study. So every study I read for my teaching and for my clinical work, I look at the methods right away to see where were the people recruited. If you're doing a pediatric oncology study, that makes sense to do it down here because everyone pediatric oncology is pretty much going to your academic health center. But if you're doing sinusitis, you're doing acne, you're doing hypertension, you're doing type 2 diabetes, you need to recruit out here. And like I said, we reviewed the FDA the last 3 years, approved drugs for primary care settings. They were all done down here. And then you need to say, oh, it works up here. Well, it doesn't. Well, it might, but we don't know that. There's no proof to show it does. For one of my larger studies where we had to recruit really quickly, and we wrote about this, we did a grassroots political approach to recruiting. So you really need to think about how you're going to recruit these patients. There's lots of different ways, but you really need to think about it a priori. What we did for the study I'm going to talk about today, and I talked about, is we did practice-based research networks. Those are networks, and I think Andrew will probably talk more about his network, but there's the networks of either private or public primary care practices to get together interested in conducting research. Do you need to work with your PBRN? So my PBRN here, we have 6 PBRNs in the study. I think we have 120 offices for the PBRN, but not every office is going to be interested in every question. You need to work with them and see what their setup is. Can they do it? How can they do it? And which offices? So of the 120 offices, we might end up using like 20 to 30 that are relevant to help us or interested in this study. I would recommend this. You need to put some of your budget for the PBRN directors. You can't go to them and just expect them to do research. It costs money to do research, and you need to put that into your budget. I already talked a little about this. We have never done a pilot trial before. It's been a godsend. We have made many changes. We do still need to go back to PCORI because it's a contract, not a grant, to talk to them about some of the proposed changes for the full study. But if you can do it, you really should. So for one big example here, is in most of my studies, I prefer primary care over urgent care because the primary care physician and nurse practitioner and PA have a relationship with the patient, and it's easier to talk to them about a study. But we found out that for acute sinusitis, at least in the US, after COVID, most of this is taken care of urgent care. There's just not the human power to see enough patients in primary care. We don't have enough physicians and clinicians in general. So almost all of the urgent care, almost all the acute respiratory is sent to urgent care. So we had to shift. We had to shift in middle and start going to more urgent cares. And then again, I did talk about this. You really do need someone with expertise in clinical trials. It is an expertise. You can't just say, I've done other studies, I should do a clinical trial. But for our study, we have 4 different committees. We have a patient advisory committee, board that really gives us lots of feedback. We show them most of our clinical forms if we can ahead of time. All clinical trials are going to have a data safety monitoring board, an ethics board to review. We also have a study advisory committee. I think that's the one Sabrina's on. And then we have a dissemination and engagement committee that's going to help us figure out how to best engage the lay public and other clinicians with our results. We started with 3 focus groups, which again, if you have money for, I recommend. They taught us a lot of different things, and they really helped us change our inclusion exclusion. Because again, these are people that are really in the clinic. I'm in the clinic, but I'm in the clinic 1 day a week. These are people that are in the clinic 5 days a week, and they really understand what's going on. To show you, again, just as an example, our team. So this is our study now, and these are all the different committees that help us, and the agency, obviously, PCORI. It's been great. I don't want to talk about this. This is just to show you that, a lot goes into a trial. You need to really think about all aspects of it before. And this is our clinical trial. We have different phases of it and different randomization schemes, et cetera, et cetera. But quite a lot goes into it. You need to really write this all up a priori. I'm a big believer that if you haven't registered your trial, I don't want to read your trial. I don't find it to be useful. So you need to register a trial on a priori with everything you're going to look at and everything. Now you can make changes as long as you're clear about why you made the change, but it has to all be registered, or I wouldn't read your trial. All right, a couple more slides, specific questions that Sabrina asked me. Multi-site versus single site. So we've done, I think, 11 to 12 clinical trials, recruited well over 2,000 people. But almost all except one, I think, have been single site. There's no comparison really. Multi-site is much more difficult. It's not just like 6 single sites. It's a lot of different people you have to figure out in committees and clinics, et cetera, et cetera. So it really takes extra time. You need to figure out the IRB, and if you can, I would do a single IRB. You need to respect there's going to be differences. So we recruit different in DC than they do in Penn State, that they do in Wisconsin, et cetera. There's just different kind of practices. And Canada's a big country too, and you're going to do it differently in Western Canada than you do maybe in Toronto. No, this goes without saying, but you need to pick good people. Most of us are in primary care for the right reasons. They're going to have good people, but you need to think about who you pick to be on your team. It's a team, and they need to work together. I scarce read his block with a question. Oh, how can community clinicians and actors be involved in research? It needs to work with the flow of the office. That's the number one thing. You need to talk to the office. You need to talk to the office manager, maybe even more important than the clinical director, because the clinical director, is your colleague and understands and might even be your friend, but the office manager knows how things really work. And you need to talk to them and figure out when's the best time to talk to patients, before, after, when are the best days to be there. Some clinics don't want you there on Mondays, they're too busy, etc. So you need to really figure out that granular detail. It has to be a question they find interesting. So like I said, we're not going to go to every part of every clinic. We talk to them about the question they need to find interesting, but that's your job, to make that question interesting to them and explain to them why it's an interesting question. The ask needs to be simple. It can't be that you need to, take up everyone's room, and you need 3 rooms every time you're in the clinic, and you need to talk to patients for half hour before the clinician gets to talk to them. It needs to be a simple, straightforward ask. And you need to think about all aspects of timing, not just the clinician aspect, but the patient's aspect, the patient's timing. The patients also need to get home or go to the pharmacy or get back to work, etc. The top 3 things you need to work with primary care practice: you need to listen to them. They are all different. So for our pilot, we used, I think, 6 different offices, and they were all very different, and you need to really listen to them. You need to adapt. You need to be willing to talk to them before you submit to the IRB, before you put your full protocol in, because each office might ask for different things. You need to be willing to do that if it's possible. And sometimes you can't. Sometimes you got to say that just isn't going to work at this office. You need to think of some incentive. Continuing medical education is always important. Food, people always like food, but other kind of incentives to get the office buy-in. What makes a successful site? And by that, I think clinic buy-in and more buy-in. The number one thing we found is if we had a clinician and an office manager who was interested in our site, the research, the recruitment just takes off. There's really no problem with it. And sometimes people said they were, and then nothing happened, and we found out later that there was no real buy-in. Leadership needs to believe in it, so you do need to talk to leadership, but you need to be willing to adapt to feedback. And I want to, most important though, after leadership, is that the rest of the office needs to understand it and to really understand that they want to do this. They can't just be told by leadership, this is what you need to do, because that's not going to work. They're busy clinicians. And when there are changes requested, you do need to at least acknowledge why you didn't make the change, or why you did make the change. So I think I'm going to stop and pass it back to Andrew, and then happy to answer some questions.
Yeah,
Thanks so
that'd be
much.
great. Let's go to Andrew and then we'll take questions.
I think you'll hear a lot of similar kind of thoughts. And thank you, Dan, for that fantastic presentation. Let me just open up my slides here. Great. So thank you, Sabrina, and to everyone from the Canadian Primary Care Research Network for the invitation to present. These are my disclosures. I'm fortunate not to receive any funding from commercial entities, but just for transparency where we get our funding. And I just want to also begin by acknowledging that where I'm located, which is in Toronto, is on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And Toronto is home to tens of thousands of Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And we're very grateful for this opportunity to be situated here. I have 2 major roles. One is I work clinically as a family doc, but my 2 main kind of research roles are I direct a research team called the Upstream Lab, which has grown over time. It's almost a decade old now, and there are other scientists, and we have a large team of staff. We focus our work into kind of 3 areas: tackling the social determinants of health, data science and AI, and then clinical trials. My other role, which is more recent as of this September, is I'm the director of our local primary care practice-based research network called UpLearn. Our department is the largest academic department of family medicine in the world, with about 2,000 faculty and more than 1,000 learners. And our areas of focus, which we went through a strategic refresh and are now in these kind of 5 areas: research excellence, quality improvement, medical education, policy evaluation, and then engaging with communities as well. And you can find out more about both of these entities on our websites. To Dan's point, why primary care trials? And this is in part to really get people excited about doing trials. And we serve the vast majority of patients. We're linked to communities. Something that we don't emphasize maybe enough is that we have a very strong recognition of inequities, and we're strongly motivated to address them. We are really interested in evidence that works for very diverse populations, and actually interventions that shrink inequities. We also, within our community, we have very diverse disciplinary perspectives and diverse methodological expertise. So within our community, we have people who are experts in biostatistics and data science and processing data. We also have amazing qualitative folks, people from an anthropology or social work background, and all of these can contribute to clinical trials. We also have a deep understanding of the social determinants, and we're very well situated to evaluate with trials biological, social, and psychological interventions. And also, we're the backbone of the health system. And Dan and I didn't plan this, but I have a very similar kind of figure as his, which is from Ontario, created by colleagues at ICS, which just makes that same point that the vast majority of touches or contacts with the health system are in primary care, and a very small proportion are more in inpatient visits, relatively. So why randomized controlled trials? Because I think often people in primary care, the reality is most primary care researchers are not trialists, not yet. And part of, I think, what we're hoping to do is actually change that. So RCTs, of course, are just one type of research. And I don't think Dan or I believe that they trump every other type of research, study. And we want to get away from that idea of a hierarchy of evidence. But RCTs can emerge from other types of research that people are doing. Many people are doing systematic reviews, and they can also happen alongside other studies. So I actually think some of the most important work is where you're doing a quantitative trial, but also doing a qualitative study that helps unpack why it's working and for whom. Also, RCTs do have enormous power and influence. They influence guidelines, they influence practice in many, many ways. And also, they're currently our best way to study causal relationships. So that's very important. The other thing is, although they are expensive and time consuming, they also represent really large grants, probably both for Canadian Institutes for Health Research and NIH. These often are some of the biggest grants that are awarded for studies. So what that can mean is that the funds can be used to support other important aspects of the work that we all do: site engagement, actual physical infrastructure, getting familiar with data collection, and specimen collections. And they also help support career development. So I think all around the world, we're faced with challenges in recruiting people to primary care and also recruiting people to primary care research. But if we have more of our early career folks and mid-career getting high-profile publications, helping build teams, building their labs, this really helps advance primary care research overall. So why build networks? And I'm going to segue into talking about the Canadian Primary Care Trials Network, which just got launched last spring. So obviously efficiencies, that this can reduce work, save times and funds, and accelerate recruitment if you're operating as a network rather than others. And a really key point that other colleagues have made is we really don't need to reinvent the wheel. So even though the way that science is structured, it often focuses on individuals, focusing on their career and their CV and their publications and stuff like that. We know that there's a lot of efficiency if we actually share our collective experience. We all want to reduce research waste, and one way to do that is through networks. Also, this is about building evidence for the real world of primary care, like Dan mentioned, and that ultimately shapes practice and guidelines. It also, this is kind of a point that I want to emphasize, is I think because we're facing a crisis in recruiting people to primary care, we also need to change how people see primary care as a career path. We need to do more as a community to hold up that you can work in primary care and do research. And too often people think those are just completely different pathways. Like either you work in primary care in Canada in family medicine or related areas, or you do research and not the two together. So part of this is actually saying and showing to, schools of medical students and others that here is a career path where you can combine these two and lead world-class research. Also, these types of networks create a collective voice where we can advocate together to invest in primary care research. Here in Canada, and I know there are a number of colleagues from other countries on the line as well, I think we've struggled because we haven't had a very strong clinical trials network to advocate to say we need to invest in our infrastructure to do this work. And it also moves us to integrate a lot of the good EMR data research that we've been doing over the last decade into clinical work and see a very tight relationship between data research and clinical trials. And I'll speak more about that. So the Canadian Primary Care Trials Network, this is our website, and we got launched in April of last year. Our objectives are to support primary care researchers to design, fund, and be leaders of trials. None of us wants to simply be recruiting for trials that are being led completely by someone else and we are not involved in the science of it. So we want, even though it may be that the PI is in cardiology or somewhere else, we want to be treated as leaders. And as just an anecdote, last week, I had a colleague who reached out saying, "Hey, do you want to join this application?" And it was an important intervention in kind of nutrition, diabetes prevention type of thing. And I kind of said, "Do you have someone who's a co-principal applicant from primary care?" And because that's where like 100% of the recruitment is going to be. So they were very open to that. And but sometimes we don't, I think, ask enough. We also, our objective is to standardize our approaches. We don't need to recreate the wheel every time. We don't need to waste time and energy recreating everything from protocols, consents, how do you compensate people? How do you collect data? We can share templates for many of these things. Um, we also want to support mobilization of the knowledge that we create and make sure we have like a single point where we are saying, here's what we're finding, and get it out to people who are then making decisions. And also, we want to serve as a point of connection to other trial networks. So in Canada, there's an initiative called Accelerating Clinical Trials. And they have, in their initial group, they have 28 clinical trial networks. So they cover everything from oncology to nephrology to cardiology or whatever, but there's no primary care trial as network as yet. We actually submitted to join that group. But with those 28 networks, we could be connected to them and serve as the primary care kind of link to them. Some of our important principles are scientific excellence, so we're committed to the highest quality research, and we also want to contribute to advancing methodological advancements in this area. We want to advance health equity, and we thought that that's very important that we put it in our principles because this is also something that when a trial idea comes along, that we use it to judge whether or not we should take part in it. Is this going to reduce inequities? Is this actually going to reach vulnerable populations? National collaboration and growth, we operate as a national platform, so this is not any single person's kind of fief. In fact, we really want to rotate the chair, so it rotates amongst the different members, and we also want to center communities. So we believe, and many of our practice-based networks are already moving in this direction of really engaging with communities to help set priorities as well. So in terms of like the structure of it, the thing that we are hoping and what we're looking at is that we are a net part of the Canadian Primary Care Research Network that's hosting this webinar, that we are the kind of primary care trials network within that, and that we have a steering committee for the Canadian Primary Care Trials Network that has a voting representative from each university right now that has a faculty of medicine, as well as non-voting representatives and a separate advisory council as well. And this is kind of a proposal, this is for all the Canadians on the line, of thinking about the Canadian Primary Care Research Network, as now that, Sabrina and O'Neill, who are here, and many others have helped get it, established, having it kind of serve as a coordination group. And then there's a data cluster within this. There's the Canadian Primary Care Trials Network, and then there's a Directors Council that meets about 4 times a year at least, where all of the directors of practice-based research networks come together, and we share kind of challenges, and we help each other as well. And cutting across this all would be patient community engagement, and then also training and capacity building, and trying to bring within this existing training kind of initiatives, trying to coordinate them so that people are not duplicating efforts. So I'm going to talk a bit about Can Treat COVID as an example, large trial. So this is an adaptive platform trial evaluating different treatments for acute COVID. It's funded by CIHR and Health Canada with support from the Public Health Agency of Canada, specifically support around access to Paxlovid, which is our first treatment arm. So this is, as an adaptive platform trial, it's meant to evolve over time with additional arms and essentially continue until COVID is no longer with us, which will not unfortunately happen, or until we run out of funding, or until we have a very, very clear idea of what the best way to treat COVID is. So the inclusion criteria are anyone over 50 or 18 to 49 with one of many chronic conditions. We are actively enrolling people for this. So for all those in Canada, if you do have someone or yourself gets COVID, please consider participating in this study. And essentially, we're starting with Paxlovid for 5 days, but we have plans for another arm to start in the next few months, which is evaluating an antioxidant treatment. And then we have an ongoing process of evaluating the evidence in this area to look for new potential candidates as well. So things that may happen in the future could be, new treatments that are emerging around COVID as well. This is our big team of people who are involved. So you can see there's lots of different folks from different areas, from primary care, from infectious disease, from different emergency medicine, methodological expertise, and so on. So it's a big team of people. We're a Health Canada regulated trial, and that was an important decision. It's been actually a very good process, and really appreciate Health Canada's kind of process with this. It's been pretty good. We have 6 provincial hubs, and so we purposely set that up so that a site in Health Canada terms is traditionally like a hospital or a clinic or something. Instead, we have 6 sites that are covering the whole province that are based in a university. And so the actual address and contact info is a university site. We have a single master protocol, although unfortunately in Canada, we don't have a single REB as yet. So we do have multiple research ethics boards that we have to go through. Although Ontario has this very nice system, which is relatively new, called Clinical Trials Ontario, which does help make this a lot easier because you can assign one Ontario board as the board of record, and then it kind of ripples out throughout all of the others, and that's been very helpful. We're almost at 400 participants enrolled, and a really, really neat thing is we have now started the work to pool our data with Panoramic in the UK. We purposely designed this trial with that idea in mind. So we aligned our inclusion criteria, our data collection, and many other things so that we could pool our data with Panoramic. We anticipate having a question around Paxlovid actually by the spring or summer, which will be great. And as I mentioned, we have ongoing review of the evidence as well. This is also building the foundation for a future idea called Can Treat RESP, which is going to be an adaptive platform trial for multiple acute respiratory illnesses, so influenza, RSV, and other things like that. Some of the top 5 things I could think of that are been keys to our success. One has been, as Dan mentioned, like having fantastic people, but our outstanding staff has really been key to this. we've had a lot of cohesion amongst the scientific team, which has been really, really good. And people have been, in general, really great to work with. We've also been flexible with changes in COVID-19 and also changing contexts like changes in funding for Paxlovid, changes for funding for rapid tests availability, changes in guidelines around Paxlovid. So we've been able to adapt with that. I think our international collaboration and the ability to pool data with Panoramic has been key. And again, I know there's many people from different countries on the line. I'd love to see where we do more of that and actually have the idea of like an international primary care trials collaborative where we quickly make decisions about study design that allows us to pool across multiple countries. And then also having sufficient funding was key. You know, this was funded by a $10 million grant from CIHR and Health Canada. And that has allowed us to be able to do, you know, many different things. One of the things we did, for example, was speaking of methodological expertise, is we built within the grant, and then we did this past fall, is we hosted a really wonderful scientific meeting around adaptive platform design. And I really want to credit Benita Hosseini, who is a research scientist at the Upstream lab, for doing a huge amount of fantastic work to make this a success. And you can find out, actually, many of the sessions were recorded, and a lot of the slide decks and data sets and stuff like that are available if you're interested in adaptive platform trials. And we're actually planning to host this again, probably this coming fall. And then maybe it's something that evolves into being something that moves around to different countries, because we had colleagues from Oxford and from South Africa who were part of this. So just to conclude kind of my points, I think in the future, most high impact clinical trials will happen in primary care and community settings. This is a kind of a bold prediction, but I think where we're moving in terms of being able to monitor people remotely, the high cost of having people in hospital settings, and a variety of other factors, is that this will be the future. So what will help this happen? A national trial platform with very clear governance and transparency that builds on our existing practice-based research and learning networks, maintaining a focus on work that serves the public good. And I mean that not just in a kind of a nice kind of way. I really think that's central, including that there's benefits that return to the public. So as we are creating agreements to study different things, part of that is also that the knowledge that's generated results in a tangible benefit to the public as well. A national network of medium to large primary care clinics that are clearly designated as part of the Canadian Primary Care Trials Network. A plan to grow primary care trialists, and we've been doing some workshops on grant writing that have been open to anyone interested. I think we can grow this and love to work with the Canadian Primary Care Research Network around this idea. And then very efficient processes for recruitment and payment. We have been working on standard language around consent to be contacted for research. We've used in a variety of studies a deputized agent approach, which means having a member of the research team actually be given permission to act as a deputized agent of a clinic, and also using artificial intelligence to quickly identify participants for studies using full chart, regularly updated data sets as well. So just some final thoughts. I think this Canadian Primary Care Trials Network builds on our over a decade of work to create practice-based research in Canada, but does represent a shift to interventions and reframing what it means to be in primary care research. And we, of course, need to build this pipeline, and let's collaborate internationally around this. Like, Canada doesn't have to do it by itself. There's a lot of fantastic expertise around the world to build primary care trialists. We need to, as we grow, we'll demonstrate success, and this eventually, I think, will be the future of most trials. And we have to work with our funders and regulators to make trials easier and more efficient. A very simple thing which I've been advocating for is allowing multiple institutions to be listed as paid on grants. So when you do a multi-center trial, funds can flow, automatically to various centers. I'll stop there, and yeah, really interested in taking any questions.
Great. Thank you, both Dan and Andrew. That was fantastic. I'm going to open it up now for questions and comments and discussion. O'Neill.
All right, thanks to both Andrew and Dan for excellent presentations. I'm curious, so Andrew has put forth the idea that most primary cares the big trials that define medical care should be done in primary care. So, historically, I think a lot of them are done in specialized settings because there's a powerful financial interests that pay for those trials, right? What are the set of interests that would be invested in primary care trials, both in the United States and Canada? And thinking maybe about primary care as a very cost-effective way of providing care. I'm just curious, particularly maybe in the ACO setting or integrated health systems and insurance companies, what other potential interests could support large-scale primary care trials that define our practice?
Andrew, you
I'm
go
happy.
first.
Yeah,
I
I'm
think
happy to
you're
start.
better qualified to answer.
Well, there's a few thoughts. One is I think, it's interesting because in both of our countries, there's a lot of discussion about learning health systems. And it's in Canada, it's now become policy, but it is as yet to really, I think people are still figuring out what that means. One simple idea is often kind of the quality improvement approach, which is we're going to have a system that allows us to collect data and see whether or not changes are implemented, what the gap is, try to implement something and iterate on that. I think an advanced idea would be actually layering on trials to this idea of learning health systems. And we recently got funded through CIHR funding to actually create the foundation for an adaptive platform trial network that would evaluate policy interventions that are about helping increase access to primary care. So we were really delighted to get that funded, and we hope we get the funding to build the full kind of platform. But this kind of signals that governments and funders are starting to see that they could use these types of trial networks to evaluate things beyond the individual level medication or device. So that's one thought, is that if you had a really, enlightened kind of funder, whether it's in the US like a large insurance entity or say Medicare, Medicaid, they could start to see, wow, we could really use this infrastructure to evaluate into ways of delivering care to find the most efficient, cost-effective way of doing things. And there are now ways with data and with this type of infrastructure to do that. So that's one thought that could motivate people to invest. I think the other very simple thing is that if we look at the bulk of where patients are, and now that primary care is getting fully digitized, it allows us to quickly identify where people are. So instead of, going to, say, a specialist center that, as Dan pointed out, only sees a certain type of people in a much smaller number, if you really wanted to study the big, chronic diseases and big issues, or even very specific things like, say, lung cancer, you're going to be able to identify those people within primary care records and very quickly kind of be able to engage them in care. What I don't want to see happen, though, is that we just become the source of recruitment. Like that we're just, if you need 1,000 people with lung cancer, you can go to primary care. What we always have to do is make sure we are building our expertise and that we're part of learning and being part of the leadership of these things, and then eventually are the ones designing and proposing these types of trials.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, I think it's a great question, a positive and negative. I think that you need a funder, and PCORI was set up for comparative effectiveness research to compare, drug A and drug B. So I think they totally understand it. That's their entire mission, how they're set up. But I guess I'm a little more negative than Andrew. I think pharma is set up totally opposite. That it makes sense if I'm in charge of pharma to go to subspecialty office because it's easier to show I can improve acne by 5% and hypertension. The sicker the patient is, the easier it is to show a small improvement. So unless the FDA or regulatory authorities change and say, look, you can't do that, and then sell your drug to primary care, I just don't see it. It's just they're set up. And I agree. Things like lung cancer screening, that's different. but specific drug A, it's all set up for subspecialty offices right now, unfortunately.
So one comment I'll have on that is I'm looking at some work that's going on in British Columbia by Dr. Corinne Hole and folks here. And that is that there's the adverse drug events that happen. So this is post-market pharmacovigilance work. And there isn't a lot that's done. And actually it's to Health Canada's benefit to have primary care be involved in phase 4 pragmatic clinical trials, not to just look at the safety or the efficacy of the drug and how it works in real life, in real world, in primary care, but also to be doing monitoring pharmacovigilance in terms of drugs and adverse events, and actually trying to help do some reporting, because right now there's very little that's actually reported to Health Canada, and they're the ones in Canada that actually approve drugs. So just sort of as an aside and as one avenue for looking at who could actually fund this in Canada, or actually in the US as well, right? On sort of the FDA side, they should be interested in this kind of stuff, adverse drug events.
But you hit a pet peeve of mine.
Oh,
Look at JAMA. 2 weeks ago, JAMA had an article about the efficacy of the vaccine, the new strain. There's not a single report of one adverse event. So I wrote the authors, said, where's your adverse event data? Because I can't recommend things without a risk benefit. They didn't collect adverse event data, and it got published in JAMA 2 weeks ago.
oh,
People
wow.
don't collect adverse event data. If they think it's safe, they don't collect it. So I study a lot of probiotics, tons of our research. No one collects it. You need to collect adverse event data. So you look 2 weeks ago, JAMA, you will not see one. All it is efficacy data, and everyone who's a clinician knows efficacy data without anything else is useless. But that's all it is, efficacy data about the vaccine. And they didn't think to collect it. And I would argue that's because they had no primary care doctors on the team. Because every primary care doctor understands it's always every medicine we give has a risk benefit. And I don't think they understand that.
You know, it's interesting on the COVID vaccine, some colleagues here, Jeff Kwong, who's a family physician and public health specialist, like myself, he was part of an international team that just had a paper in Vaccine looking at about 99 million people who received COVID vaccines and looked at adverse events. Very interesting. And also, again, great example of international collaboration to do that. But it had folks with primary care backgrounds on it who were really looking at it. It was published in Vaccine. I see Anna, who is an international colleague, has a question.
Yes, I would like to hear, because it happens that the people of the initiative had the pleasure to hear about the panoramic trial when we were in Sydney. And I would like to know what is the methodology you are going to apply in order to pull data from the UK and Canada? Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. In essentially Panoramic and specifically Chris Butler and Paul Little have been huge supporters of us here in Canada from the beginning, and they're actually part of the study team for Can Treat COVID. And we had designed this from the beginning. So this is a rare kind of case where, you know, usually the idea of pooling data, you have to like then sort out a lot of the differences in what you did. But because we knew that we were planning to pool this from the very start, we designed Can Treat COVID to align to allow that pooling. So I think it's more straightforward. Actually, it's literally we use the same inclusion criteria, the same exclusion criteria, the same data is collected. There are very, very minor differences in certain things. For example, they have a viral sub-study kind of aspect. We don't have that. We do some, they do some additional data collection between days 14 to 28 days, but there's I think very minor. And we've in our meetings, we feel like there's a very good alignment. So the really practical things are creating a data sharing agreement. We already checked with Health Canada and they're on board with this, transferring the data, and then being able to do the analyses. So it's a bit more straightforward than other studies, but this is where, and I know Anna, you are helping convene an international group around practice-based research networks. And this is where I would love us to go as an international community, is more like almost like a body that could decide and help coordinate these types of collective efforts, not just for a pandemic, for other large-scale trials. Like for example, we're doing a study around colchicine in people with diabetes for cardiovascular prevention, and there are other countries kind of involved already with this outside of Canada. And how can we use this as an opportunity to build this type of table where we come together and actually make decisions about, the design of studies and essentially kind of resolve differences so that we could pool data in the future. But that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, I was thinking that this is the role of the initiative we have launched with Vonca in collaboration with NAPGRAH. And I would like to invite you. I think it would be really provocating if we bring people from the Panoramic and you come on board and have a learning session for the people of the initiative, because now I think that the time was a little bit uncomfortable and Australians are not on board, and I know that many people are interested. And I think that also I would like to hear a little bit about the use of artificial intelligence from you, from your side. And I have someone who is interested in collaboration from the Netherlands, and I would like to bring you together. This is the role of the initiative, to make bridges between the scientists and make facilitation of this multinational and cross-region collaboration. So welcome.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
that's-
I know several of us from Canada are going to join that call next week, I think, on Thursday morning, our time, or maybe it's this week, I can't remember. But yeah, it'll be great. And I think that a specific area around using AI to identify participants for studies would be a great area for collaboration, because we don't have to all recreate the approach, but it's a standard, and sharing in a kind of an open source way the methods would be great.
Yeah,
That's
and
great.
it happens
Thank
to
you.
say
Okay,
that everyone thinks.
Anna, I'm just gonna move on because there's a couple more questions. But maybe you guys can continue offline, but it sounds awesome. This is exactly what we want to see. Dr. Gagior? Sorry, I'm probably
Right, Gagior,
And then Frank.
Yes, thank you. From the German perspective, thank you both for your exciting talks, and congratulations to your successful networks. Really a great job. Could you give me a few more information about the trialist you were speaking about? So what kind of clinicians are they? Are they young academic family physicians, or are they more in the practice? I'm asking because we do both, and it is very difficult to engage family physicians from their practices, because the burden of a clinical trial is really high. And for example, they need a GCP training which lasts 2 full days. And not just they have to be paid for it, but where it is lots of time, and to conduct a trial in their own practices. And the German practices are not as large as the Canadians are, is really a lots of effort, much more than it is on top to the usual business caring for patients.
Yeah, Dan, do you want to start like your thoughts about how do we grow the next generation?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need clinical trialists, and then you need clinicians to help do the project. So the way we set it up is the clinicians don't have to do the GGP. Now it matters how you decide your IRB and everything like that, but because we send a research coordinator who's done all the courses, the city, why don't we call them different private, but the training you need to do that. And they've done the 2 days, but they work for my team and they're in the office. So the clinician there is usually just letting us have their patients, or maybe they'll do an evaluation, say, I think patient is safe for me in your study, et cetera, but they're not the ones doing informed consent, collecting data. and analyzing data. So we might have on this big study 400 clinicians that are helping us do that, and we'll have 6 clinical trialists that are more academic that are going to do the other part. And then we're going to have like 40 or 50 research associates that are going to go to the different offices. But you're right, we would never ask any of the working clinicians, especially us, because it's usually private physicians who, it's really a small business they're running, to take time out, even if we could pay them to do that. I don't know how Andrew's doing.
Yeah, very similar kind of thing. I think each country needs kind of a cadre of trained people who are really mentored and supported to become those clinical trialists. Maybe, on the order of kind of 12 to 15 people a year who are identified and get specific training and support to not only do the training, but also to help them design trials and get mentored along that way. And that's where I think international collaboration would be neat. Like, what would it look like if we had like a dozen people from Germany, a dozen people from the US, a dozen Canadians, and so on? Like, it would be a really neat community. And we also don't have to all create this training ourselves. We could all, share that as well. But I agree with Dan. Then you have a group of what we call like site leads who are more responsible to help champion the study, and they do get engaged as co-authors on papers, and they are helping then kind of with the local site engagement, but we don't expect them to do all the training and whatnot and things like that.
Yeah, no, that's great. So we're gonna move on to just this last question. Yes, go ahead, Frank. Quick. We'll give quick answers.
Okay, thank you very much for the inspiring presentation. I would like to ask, Andrew said that you use AI in the recruiting participants. Maybe, I don't know if time will permit us to throw more light into how do you use it in getting participants to participate in the trial?
Yeah,
and
I
my
think
second question is your network ready to collaborate or to be involved in other, let's say, trials, some research activities in other parts of the world, to say, for instance, Africa or in Europe? Currently in University of Eastern Finland, but we are making application for trials to be done in Sub-Saharan Africa. I would like to ask if that is
two thoughts. I think we should do like another session on AI to derive to identify participants, because I think that's a great topic and sounds like a lot of interest. And then absolutely, I think we have a really strong strong kind of commitment to expanding primary care research around the world. And one of the really neat things was having colleagues from South Africa join the Adaptive Platform Trial Initiative, and we've built a really nice relationship because they are also doing adaptive platform trials around COVID treatments and long COVID. So I think this is a global effort, and I think there could be really great learnings from everybody.
That's great. I mean, I think this is so wonderful, and it's obviously just a start, but clearly there's more interest and need. So I just want to thank again, Dan and Andrew, so much for doing this session. It's so much needed, and I hope to see you both at the PBRLN NAPCRG happening in June in Reston, Virginia. And we'll arrange for some more time for us all to get together. And thank you, Anna, also, and look forward to working with you all. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.